Growing up in Russia, March 8th was always one of my favorite holidays. We didn't even have to call it Women's Day. We just said March 8th, and everyone understood. And there was this specific flower, these yellow little pea-sized balls on a branch with a very special fragrant smell. And that flower was always associated with this day. And I just found the name of this flower. It's called mimosa, or also known as the silver wattle. And I found it in an interesting source, Italy Magazine. It turns out that March 8th also has been celebrated in Italy for a long time, called Festa della Donna. And the story is that Italy based this date initially on the Russian date of March 8th, which was based on a strike that women held on March 8, 1917. And that was based on a strike by women garment workers in New York on March 8, 1857. But this March 8th, I am worried. And I'm worried for three reasons. One is the banning of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this was based on Trump's executive order on January 20th, where he requested federal agencies within 60 days to terminate all DEI and similar offices, all equity action plans, equity actions, initiatives, programs, etc. And 3 days later, the FDA removed its diversity in clinical trials initiative from its website. So that initiative has been in development for several years, and the guidance that the FDA has originally developed said that the sponsors who are conducting the clinical trials should consider whether certain groups, for example, older patients, pediatric patients, males, females, a particular race or an ethnic group, or combinations thereof, may have a different response to the medical product. On Thursday, Marty Makary held his confirmation hearings and was asked about this diversity in clinical trials program by Senator Blunt Rochester, a Democrat from Delaware. Let's listen.
You agreed. We talked about the importance of clinical trial diversity, but I want an assurance that you will stand up to any Trump administration actions that conflict with this. So again, yes or no, do you believe clinical trial diversity is critically important? That's an easy one.
Well, if you're talking about a trial of sickle cell disease, are we saying that we need to have white people in a trial of sickle cell?
What a stupid, racist comment this is. Clearly, he was prepared. He knew this question was coming. The lawyers who prepared him knew this was coming. Senator Blunt Rochester said, we talked about this. But he had to stay within the party line. Diversity is bad. So he had to say something negative. Trump is watching. The Heritage Foundation is watching. Its hawkish new CEO, Kevin Roberts, is watching. He called diversity and inclusion fake and lame in his book, Dawn's Early Light. I realized I'm promoting it a little too much, but I think it's important for all of us to read this book, with a preface by J.D. Vance. So he had to say something negative. But really, this is the only thing he could come up with to start answering this question, that in a trial in a predominantly African American disease, there's no need for a diversity plan. And by the way, the Department of Education made a similar anti-DEI request on February 14th, giving 14 days to implement. Of course, it's now being challenged in the courts. But at the time, NPR interviewed Cynthia Jackson Hammond, the president of the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. And she was asked, what happens if the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are not around? And she said, too often we focus just on diversity. And the second part of diversity, equity, and inclusion is equity, which means fairness. Being able to have programs that support women in leadership or women just in the work environment, that's fairness. Prior to the constructs of DEI, there was very little alternatives or options for women to have a fair and equal chance to succeed in the communities or in higher education in general. The second reason I worry is that it was hard enough to get an abortion before Trump's new administration, and it will get worse. As I explained in my latest podcast, The Language of Evidence, episode 3, there are three factions within the conservative movement: libertarian, traditionalist, and corporatist. And the traditionalist is the one that is pro-life, pro-family, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, anti-transgender, etc. And there's a nice article 3 weeks ago in JAMA by a professor of OBGYN from Baylor College of Medicine in Texas called The Consequences of Legislative Regulation in Medicine. He says that in addition to Texas, 13 states have now have near total abortion bans. They often do not include exceptions for rape, incest, lethal chromosomal abnormalities, or lethal fetal abnormalities. The sum total effect for patients is confusion, fear, decreased access, decreased patient safety, decreased quality, with restrictions on evidence-based care. There was a case recently where 20 women were denied abortion care after pregnancy complications, many of which resulted in severe morbidity. 3 maternal deaths in Texas recently reported by ProPublica. And he concludes that healthcare policy determined by ideology is nothing short of dangerous. And reason number 3. On January 20th, Trump issued this executive order called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism. It says, gender ideology replaces the biological category of sex with an ever-shifting concept of self-assessed gender identity, permitting the false claim that males can identify as and thus become women and vice versa, and requiring all institutions of society to regard this false claim as true. And there's a whole series of requirements that agencies have to adhere to. Specifically, it instructs federal agencies not to request gender identity from people and end federal funding for gender ideology. The NBC interviewed Jennifer Pizer, the chief legal officer at a civil rights organization that litigates on behalf of LGBTQ Americans. And she said, the president can't, with a wave of a pen, change the reality of who people are and the fact that we as a community of people exist. We have equal protection rights just like anybody else does. And there's a recent article, and that I'm including in the Substack post all of these references, that in fact, over the last several years, we have seen an exponential rise in proposed and debated anti-trans legislation in the United States. But what these authors, these psychologists conclude is that this is all justified by this what's called benevolent sexism. We're actually protecting women and children by doing this. But actually, these policies are associated with outcomes that are detrimental, not just to the transgender community, but also to the very groups that these laws purport to protect. So this March 8th, I think about people who are discriminated, who had hopes for fairness based on race, gender, and a myriad of other characteristics. I think about women who need an abortion. And I think about the about 1.6 million people in the US who identify as transgender. And I worry. Happy March 8th, everyone.